Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're so pleased to have you join us. This is the ACRL Research Agenda in Scholarly Communication in the Research Environment webinar. I'm Patricia Sway. I chair the Research and Environment Committee, or RESEC, in ACRL. RESEC is a goal area committee within the association, and our primary role is to help ACRL fulfill its strategic objectives for scholarly communication. I'm joined today by the Vice Chair of the committee, Yasmin Shourish, who will conclude today's webinar presentation with some parting remarks. So my role this afternoon is basically to kick things off with some framing about the research agenda before letting our speakers do their presentation. ACRL's research agenda for scholarly communication was last updated, believe it or not, in 2007. And in that time, there's been a lot of change in this area. If you consider, for example, the number of librarians who have scholarly communication in their titles, the increasing currency of open access scholarship and publishing among not only librarians, but also faculty and students, the calls for more openness in scholarship and publishing, and even the changing nature of what publishers are focusing on. That is not only the publication of original research, but also products that are addressing research workflow and research information management issues. So it's a different world, and this different world demands a new research agenda. To help us with this work, ACRL has hired two consultants, Nancy Marin and Rebecca Kennison, each with an extraordinary and extensive history in scholarly communication. Today's webinar is an opportunity for Nancy and Rebecca to walk us through their process for this work and to inform the community of their approach and what they're doing. But it's also an opportunity for the community, you and the audience, to ask questions of Nancy and Rebecca, which both Nancy and Rebecca have said it's fine to ask questions via the chat, and Erin will, and Elois will help moderate with that. So without further ado, I will let Nancy and Rebecca introduce themselves and launch us into the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. And I will note that it looks like our little mini heads on the side look somewhat similar to the headshots that we've actually put on the screen for you. So there should be no doubt that we are actually who we say we are. I'm thrilled to be here. I'll say just briefly, for folks I have not yet met before, how excited I am to get to work on this. The first chunk of my professional career was actually working in publishing, in trade publishing, then in scholarly publishing, textbook publishing, before I was with Ithaca S&R. And when I was with Ithaca S&R, I got to take kind of my graduate school background and work on developing research agendas. In that case, it was having to do with the sustainability of kind of fill in the blank. I had the pleasure of working on things like digital humanities, looking at new forms of scholarly publishing. But that's the space I was working in. So now I have my own firm, and the fact that I get to continue to work on these questions at a moment where so much is changing, really just for me is a thrill. So I'm very happy to be here. And Rebecca, I'm sure, will introduce herself.
Yeah, and I'm also very delighted to be here and to be able to work with Nancy and with all of you on this project. And I know that we're very keen to hear from as many people as possible about the work that we're going to be doing. And we'll give you, as we go through this, we'll give you opportunities to be able to do that, not just today to ask some questions, but also to engage more directly with us in the work that we're doing. As many of you know, I'm also come out of this world very strongly. Was in scholarly publishing, academic publishing for many years. Mostly on the STEM side at PLOS, for example, but also did humanities and social science work, and a lot of the work that I've been doing lately has been in humanities and social science. I spent 8 years at Columbia within the libraries as the director for the Center for Digital Research and Scholarship, where I got to work with a lot of library colleagues as well as faculty. And so a lot of the work that we're doing here has been informed by that background as well. And so here we are.
Here we are. Thank you, Rebecca. So as Patricia outlined, and if you saw the original call, you may have been as kind of impressed and slightly overwhelmed as we were and continue to be by the ambition of what this project is. What ACRL has put out there, and in particular the Research Environment Scholarly Communications Committee, is ways to figure out what's going on in this space that can accelerate the transition to and build capacity for a more open, inclusive, and equitable system or systems, right? And there's a lot packed into that idea. And Rebecca and I have been spending some good deal of time trying to pull that apart so we understand how we can best hear from you and the rest of the community about what elements of this really are the most, you feel are the most important, because that's what we want this agenda to be. So the two elements in here that we constantly keep in mind are how important it is to make sure that the process that we've designed and we're going to be carrying out is really community-based. You'll see in the next several slides that we're certainly doing plenty of work on our own to understand what's going on in the landscape, but then we're doing a lot of work actually to have points of contact with you and people engaged in scholarly communications so that we understand what the real issues are. There's a special focus in this, you've probably noticed, that has to do with making sure that we don't always hear from the same people who have been represented in previous agendas. And so we've tried again to identify what we are assuming, but based on what folks have told us and what we've observed and understand, what some of those groups might be. So even on this call, if you hear what our approach is and you feel that there might be other categories, we hope you'll share that with us as well. So, you know, the first thing is that no phrase in that original statement really can go without further inspection. And we'll give you the short version on this call, and maybe there'll be time if you folks would like to chat with us about it, we can. But just to get started, when we think about scholarly communication and research environment, the scope that ACRL would like us to look at is awfully broad. We're literally talking about the act of creation of scholarship, so the research space and the work people do, how they do that work, what they do it with, how they're funded for it, all the way through the way scholarship is created. So Rebecca and I have our own kind of short form of thinking about this as a workflow, from creating content, thinking about how it gets published, selected, edited, reviewed, put out in the world, shared, and its impact and value measured. So we're thinking about this as a real kind of life cycle, and we're trying to make sure we don't really miss anything if there are elements there that could be better. And so what do we mean by better? And that brings me to the second bullet. Our mandate here is quite specifically to take on the challenge of asking, is the system today open enough, inclusive enough, fair enough, equitable enough? Again, we could probably spend the whole webinar breaking down any one of those terms, so I will pass on that challenge. But I will say that one of the things we're doing here is even encouraging the people we speak with to help us to define for them what some of these terms mean. In other words, when people hear the word open, does that mean free access to content, availability or access to the tools to create content? What does inclusion mean? Is it the people who get to participate in accessing things? Is it the people who get to participate in creating scholarship? And so on and so forth. So we want to make sure that we may have working definitions, but they are not necessarily the final story until we've heard from the community. And finally, we want to make sure that we don't get so excited by this mission of making everything more open, inclusive, and equitable that we lose sight of the fact that our mandate really still has to squarely be around scholarly communication. So what we're constantly challenging ourselves to do is look for where that intersection lies. Rebecca, did you want to add anything? Do you have any thoughts? Or does that sound close enough for now?
I think that sounds close enough for now, although hopefully in the question and answer period, we might be able to drill down a little bit more into some of these things if you guys have some ideas about how you wish to respond. Most of what you're going to see as we go forward is how we're looking to bring the community in to answer these questions, though. So stick with us.
So I think maybe I'll mention this next slide, Rebecca, and maybe hand it back over to you. So this is our approach. As you've been warned, these steps, some of which are just us, but many of them really require your participation. We're doing a phase where we're going to look around at the landscape, and in that case for us, that means a literature review, the landscape of, and also the current research going on. That's another critical piece. We definitely want to know who's actually taking these questions forward already. We're going to be speaking with, and have already begun to speak with, experts in the fields, again, so we know where that cutting edge lies and what the future questions are. We are working on launching a survey and a series of focus groups, and you'll be hearing more about that soon. They'll be launching very soon. And the goal here is to make sure for the survey, we're hoping a lot of people come in and that we can help prioritize in the focus groups. It's a slightly different twist you'll hear about. And then we'll have times where people come together actually and discuss this in person. Finally, this will result in a published paper. But we'll give you a little more detail on what this is going to look like. So I'll turn it back over to Rebecca.
Rebecca, I think you're on mute.
So I am, thank you. Okay, better? So understanding the landscape is the first thing that we've been looking to do while we've been queuing up the focus groups and surveys and so on. Really been looking at, since 2007, as Patricia mentioned, that was the last time that Research Agenda was put out, kind of taking a look to see what's shifted, and really been looking at the open, inclusive, and equitable part, the social justice part, and how that connects with scholarly communication. So we're looking at who's already working on these questions. We're looking at published literature, at blogs, at presentations that have been done. And we're also looking at areas that need considerably more work. So there's a lot of work that's being done in some areas, and a lot more work, thankfully, that needs to be done going forward, since that's the whole point, is to really come up with the kinds of questions that would lend themselves to research going forward. So to date, we've been looking at social justice broadly, diversity, inclusion, and equity specifically, and especially what this looks like in academic and research libraries and in scholarly communication itself. As Nancy already said, scholarly communication is very broad, but really trying to focus on what the discussions are within academic and research libraries. And so we've, again, been looking concentrated on librarians and archivists for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, and have already looked at 200 sources to start to help to inform where we think the questions are, where we have heard the concerns, and so on. So I think we're getting a really good handle on what people have said in public. And now we're going to turn to more personal conversations with the community to try to unpack some of those things.
So the phase that we're calling Speaking with Experts is intended to actually bring in voices from different backgrounds. So the original list of folks to be interviewed includes folks who can speak about certain issues because they have already been thinking very deeply about this. In terms of the representation question, in addition to that, something that Rebecca and I have been talking about is how important it really is to be in dialogue with the people who are actively engaged in, again, like this kind of the cutting edge of the research that's taking place. I think it would be a great outcome for the research agenda, not just to show what work has been done already, but to point to the ongoing work and to point to the individuals and the projects and the funders and where this activity is really taking place right now. Because the intention very much is for other people to be able to take on these next generation questions. So I feel like the more we can do to kind of understand who the people are in this network of researchers, the better. So when we speak with these folks, the questions have to do sometimes with a specific topic that they may be interested in, but I've also been asking questions that do have to do with their interpretation of what would make the system better. In your take, we try very hard at the beginning of the interview not to focus in too tightly on specific things that we think are important, but to see what surfaces first. So this is an ongoing piece of work, and if you have suggestions for people, you should let us know after the webinar. So I think this next piece Rebecca is going to talk about, this is kind of this trio of activities that will involve a great and very intense stage of community consultation.
Yeah, so as we've mentioned already, but we will mention it over and over again, so keep you guys focused on what we're doing here. We have three ways that we're looking to engage with you all and with other members of the ACRL community to provide us with insight and feedback on the work that we're doing. So one of those is a survey, which we're looking to launch very soon and will be open through July. This will be, as you might expect, we'll be looking at questions about what we think the main areas are that that are of importance, and we'll be asking people to help us to prioritize those. What are the most important things to all of you? And again, the focus, as with all this work, will be on openness and inclusiveness and equity. But we're also looking at the broader scholarly communication landscape too. So we'll be launching that very soon, and stay tuned. I'm sure you'll be hearing from us. The next part is listening to the community. We're going to be having 7 focus groups of about a dozen or so people each. We will be capping them to make them small enough that we can have a really engaged conversation. The dates and times you can see on the right-hand side there. If you quickly know when you're already available and know that you want to participate in one of these focus groups, you can jot this down. But again, we'll be putting out some more information after this webinar about how to sign up and register for these. These are intended to engage in particular, but not limited to, underrepresented minorities. So we're really looking forward to talking to people who haven't necessarily felt like they were being heard as loudly and clearly as we hope everybody will be.
Rebecca, could I jump in and kind of expand on that definition a little? Sure. Since I've already butted in. So when Rebecca says underrepresented, we should mention that we've already attempted to break this into a couple of different ways that folks might be underrepresented in the research agenda. So there's one category that has to do with people who are parts of cultural or ethnic groups that may be underrepresented in this space. And that itself is a bit of a stew, but that's what that category looks like, which is a very different category from people who, let's say, are at community colleges, which we feel, and it's in a very different way, but equally important, are likely underrepresented when we think about what library publishing often looks like. Another category are people who have some type of disability. When we think about what would make things fairer, more accessible, those disabilities actually are a critical thing to take into account. And so one of our focus groups is going to encourage participation from people who can inform us about what the key issues are for them. So we're trying to tackle this in a bunch of different ways. So we're looking at cultural issues, physical limitations and issues, and economic limitations and issues. There may be more, but those are the ones that come to mind. And when we circulate the final list, we'll label which focus groups we are hoping can zero in on which of those areas, make it a little easier for everybody.
And then finally, we're also having 3 in-person roundtable conversations to discuss these issues in detail. And we've already had one, and maybe Nancy in a second can talk about some of the takeaways that came out of the Library Publishing Forum, which was held on May 22nd, where had very good turnout. Again, some of you may have been in that room. Had more than 30 people who, which was a really great turnout for us to start off a conversation that was way too short, I hear. We're also planning on having a couple of conversations. One is the Scholarly Communication Discussion Group that meets at ALA in New Orleans on June 24th. That'll be from 2:30 to 3:30. And then we're also going to have a research agenda working session. And again, that session will be available to people who want to show up and have a conversation with us. That'll be from 4 to 5 also on Sunday the 24th. And then finally, we're also going to be at the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color meeting in Albuquerque on September 28th. Where we'll also be having a conversation. Our hope for that conversation is to be able to give people a draft, or at least something to respond to pretty substantively, something to respond to of the white paper and the proposed research agenda, so we can really hear from the community again about these are the things that this is what we've heard, and these are the things that we think are really important, and get some feedback there before we finish drafting that. So those are our 3 in-persons. And so again, if you're going to be at ALA or you're going to be at the JCLC, we'd love to talk to you.
Are there any questions? I feel like I could take a pause if there are any questions where I can forge on. I'll offer the summary, and then folks can start to think if they have things they'd like to share. So this is really the range of activities. The first phase, which we're very much in the middle of right now, is the interviewing, the literature review, and this series of roundtables, focus groups, and the survey. So you're going to be hearing from us. You'll hopefully see the calls on social media, and hopefully through various lists, to participate in the focus groups on the online survey. And we strongly encourage you to participate and to share this with your friends and colleagues. We feel like the more people who actually can have some input, the better chance there is that what we end up with is something that actually speaks to what everyone's priorities are. The next phase is actually fairly substantial as well. And when we first looked at this, we both remarked at what an intense kind of review period is built into this, and rightly so. So we hope to have this first draft at the end of the summer, so that we're starting to share it in September. And it's built to have at least a round, if not 2, of feedback from ACRL in the fall. Assuming all goes to plan, the aim is to have a publication at the beginning of 2019, and a way that we can also be sharing, again, not just what's going on now, and as we wrote the paper, but to kind of put some pointers out to the future and find creative ways to encourage people to pick up pieces of the agenda, take them forward, and continue to let, maybe not us personally, but to let ACRL know that the work is ongoing, so that we have a way to see what impact this agenda will have on the community and on this work. So,
before you move on to the slide, Nancy, there's a question here about how the experts were chosen, and I just want to clarify if, Laura, do you mean the expert interviews those experts? Yes.
Yeah, so it was a combination of, so I should also mention that the other thing that's worth mentioning about this particular project is that Rebecca and I are the researchers, but there are many, many stages at which our work is, it's almost as if the RESEC is our advisory board, a client/advisory board. And so that list, if I'm remembering correctly, was generated through a combination of suggestions that came to us through them, and contacts that we had or we felt would be valuable. my personal take on this as well is that when I come across a topic or a person that I think is going to be valuable to help inform this, I will tend to add them in as well, just because we need to learn what we need to learn for this stage. So when I said, if you had a suggestion, we already have a list of the names of the folks we've been reaching out to and interviewing, but I wasn't joking about that. My ears are open, and if I hear something that I feel like I need to understand better, I'm not opposed to speaking to more people.
We have another question.
Which I'm happy to take this page.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. You saw that?
Absolutely. Okay. We are looking at colonial influences and the decolonialization of the academy more generally, of the how to put this, but since it's you, Paige, I'll just say the complicitness of the library community within that, and so on. So yeah, it's been a great area of work that we've been looking at on the literature review side, and it will absolutely help to inform the work going forward. So I believe that you'll. I mean, yeah. So if you're happy to participate within those conversations with us, that would also be very helpful for us to make sure that we're properly addressing the concerns that you're raising there. But yes, absolutely, very important.
To add, this is Patricia. I would just to add to that, before this work officially started with Nancy and Rebecca, there was a subgroup within RESEC, within the Research and Scholarly Environment Committee, that did a kind of, that explored, how we would want to go about updating the research agenda. And so very intentionally, this group reached out to librarians of color, librarians who work in Native American or tribal communities. So there's definitely an inclusive approach being considered here. Paige had another question. Are you considering international experts? I don't know, Nancy and Rebecca, if you want to respond to that, or as well as Yasmin. I can just say that I think the focus has been on scholarly communication in the US, but I don't think that we're ruling out how other spheres, especially abroad, are also impacting scholarly communication. And certainly I think we're taking into consideration the need to be more mindful of, for example, publishing in the Global South, or the needs of the Global South to have access to publications that are happening or being distributed in North America. I'm sure that my colleagues, though, have something else to say or something more to add.
So also the other way around, I would say one of the concerns that's been raised is the unidirectional flow north to south in how scholarly communication has been performed, shall we say, and a lot of concerns about how to make sure that there's a bidirectional. I see. What do we mean by the Global South? Not Europe, not the United States and Canada, and probably not Australia. But yeah, so Southern Hemisphere. Yeah, that's it's shorthand for what sometimes is called developing world, but is not entirely that either, and so on. Yeah, it's not very helpful necessarily, but global north normally are those, Europe and North America, and global south is kind of the rest of the world. But normally has to do primarily with work that's being done in Latin America and Africa, and also think some of the concerns about what's happening in Asia fall a bit outside of that, but not entirely. So but we're definitely looking at you can't untangle the questions, particularly to Paige's original question about colonial influences. You can't untangle what goes on within the global North from what's going on in the global South, and how to make the in terms particularly of the equitable and inclusiveness and openness. I mean, all of those things. You actually have to engage people. We haven't really put on interviews for international experts, though. I don't know that we'd be opposed to adding those. I'm looking at Nancy now.
Yeah, so this is a great segue to a quick anecdote from the Library Publishing Forum. So at that roundtable, which was like not recommended to anyone to attempt a breakneck speed of 45 minutes at a first go through a complex agenda, but what was clear was that in the room we had the topic of the Global South and representation and understanding kind of rose to the top right away. And in that meeting was Reggie Raju, who's a fellow at LPC this year, from the University of Cape Town. And that's someone I'll be speaking with again that I've met previously also through my work with OJS. And the reason I mention that is because even with the Global South, if we think about that as a category and what the obstacles are, it's not just one kind of obstacle. So one type of obstacle, for example, is just availability. So it's a cost issue, or a technology issue. So having, for example, open source options becomes a category of a solution. But what came up at the LPC forum that was fascinating is that's not what they were talking about. They were talking about a lack of cultural understanding about scholarly practices in places that aren't North America and Europe. So that certain kinds of scholarly outputs may be unfairly considered not as good as, if not outright predatory. So again, to my mind, this is a constant question of we're encouraging people to help by identifying what the problem is, where there are barriers to access. But then part of our job too is figuring out what can help surmount those obstacles. Is it a technical solution? We have to make things free. We have to make the technology better or easier to use or quicker to download. Is it a cultural question? We need to actually do case studies and educate people about practices that aren't our own. So to my mind, it was a very rich conversation because it reminded us that the problems may look one way, but the solutions can take a lot of different directions. So again, that's just a little flavor of the way we're hoping to look at these issues.
And by we actually mean you.
Yes, exactly.
As in, so these are the elements that will go into the research agenda in some possible ways. But there's a lot of really important work that needs to be done in these areas that started to be done already. But I think there's a very great need for a lot of thinking to be done collectively around these.
I wonder, I mean, that we see that there are about 40 people on this call right now. I wonder if anyone has like a favorite issue or a burning issue that they just would like to share. I'm always curious to hear. Webinars are a terrible format to ask an open question like that, but I see we have a couple of minutes, so I am wondering if in the same way that we had Paige raise the question of colonial influences, I wonder if other people say, gee, I really hope X ends up in this agenda. Hey, Allegra, let's see. So the question is, or the comment is, I'd like to know how budget and subscription decisions through the OA pathways, and I see a link, impact the Global South. Can we unmute participants so Allegra can unpack this a little?
Or I can take a stab at it too. So, so to Allegra's question, I can say that in November 2016, at at University of Kansas, we held a really interesting conversation about article processing charges and invited people from a variety of backgrounds, including from Latin America and Africa, to join us within that group. And I think that's starting to get to your question, Allegra, and if it's not, let me know. But really thinking about really thinking about how what works within the traditional subscription environment, and now shifting that over into an environment that again is, looking at openness, but doing so that requires article processing charges and other kind of charges that haven't historically been levied on people within Latin America and Africa in particular. That it used to be that they could produce materials and that would be totally fine, but now if we're shifting to a what I call a micropayment concept, then that is can be very, very detrimental to the participation. Things can then be open to read, but not open to participate. And so, yeah, it's a big concern, but yes, absolutely something that we want to look at, that we want to address, that we want to make sure is on people's agenda to really take a look at. Does that answer your question, Allegra? Yeah, sort of. Thanks. Okay. Next
So
one.
the question on religious influences, did you want
to? That's really good. I'm going to admit to a certain amount of blind spottishness there. So if I don't know if you have any ideas there. I have to say it hasn't explicitly come up, but Jennifer, if you have some literature that you think we should look at,
Becca,
whatever, we'd be happy to do that.
Sorry, this is Yasmin. I was just speaking from the committee perspective. I think one thing that we are interested in is sort of the stewardship and agency in community produced works. So the religious newspapers and publications might factor into that as a community, what their agency is in the access of their works to the research environment, and also sort of how it's being represented within the research environment. While not focusing thus far specifically on religious ephemera or publications, we are thinking about communities, and particularly communities that don't have a lot of representation in the academy. There is a question, I'm sorry, some of these questions are just coming to the panelists and some are coming to all attendees. The question was, what about religious influences? Are religious newspapers and publications underrepresented in the research environment?
Yeah, and so thanks. That's really helpful, Yasmin. And I think, one thing that we are definitely, that has come up quite often is also a related issue about collection development and collection priorities, that whether we're talking about special collections, or we're also talking about just collection practices. So I think it does touch on all those things, but we'll definitely, yeah. So Jennifer again, clarifying her question, is saying vis-a-vis religious influences, for example, Catholic newspapers and other denominations are not much represented in the for-profit or publicly available digital newspaper collections chronicling America or state collections. These newspapers are not as readily available to researchers. Our organization is developing the online news archive, freely available to all. So that's a great example of the kinds of materials that could be out there. And for us, I think it's also a question about priorities, digitization priorities, and so on. So I think that's something to really keep in mind, like how things done and selected and how they get out there.
So I wanted to take on this other question, which in the scroll we almost lost here, but it's from Christy, and it has to do with a focus on librarians being or having the risk of missing voices that are crucial to the cultural change aspect. So I would actually, if you were sitting here, I would love to hear actually what you think needs to be included. But I'm going to guess I entirely agree with you, and I'll mention a couple things. The first is that because I know Rebecca's slide on the lit review mentioned the focus on libraries, but this is just the beginning, and that's the literature review. So I think the point is to look where there are things that are written that are kind of dead on for what we're focusing. But as we learn more, I think the goal is to read research not just from people in libraries, but anyone who's actually conducting this research that could inform libraries. I think for sure you want to keep the focus pretty broad. You want the best information there is that can get you to the outcomes you want. Simple as that, whoever's doing the work. So that piece will not be zeroed in just on libraries. But in terms of the subjects we're covering, I failed to mention something actually really important when I talked about the workflow. So on one hand, we have, as if there's not enough to chew on, just in looking at a publishing workflow in the broadest sense, it became clear to us pretty early that there were a couple of major cross-cutting themes that really don't attach to any stage of the workflow, but they're more systemic, organizational level and cultural kinds of issues. So we're still working up how to exactly formulate this, but one of them has to do with business models and organizational models to support scholarly communications. Right now, I can't think of anything that seems to be a hotter topic than, who builds this stuff, who owns this stuff, at what level should it be organized? I think that's actually a critical question right now, and one that we hear about all the time. And then the other question is cultural change. So what would be a bad outcome from this agenda is if, with your support, we develop a lovely document that doesn't result in actually any change at all in the actual world we live in. That would be a bad outcome. So we feel like there probably is a set of questions around here where we have to think about what can facilitate any findings that come out of this research. The research is intended to give people the understanding and knowledge and do the analysis to get to a next step. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how to describe what those issues and what those questions might start to look like. But I think I'm agreeing with you that part of that has to be in here too. What will make it possible to actually affect change? Yeah.
Yeah, and we do know that that of course nobody is operating within a vacuum here. So culture change can't happen without institutional and organizational change.
This is Patricia. Would it be fair, Nancy and Rebecca, to say also that as you do these focus groups and in-person meetings, that you will learn from attendees who else to talk to, and what pockets of the community could be better represented in terms of these interviews and what you're learning from the questions that you ask. But we're already in just these 3 or 4 questions. We already have learned loads about how we could, shape this even further, or how it will, shift in attention a little bit, or include or embrace some other foci, but without, obviously extending the scope so much that the work doesn't get done.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely. This is going to be a learning process for everybody. I mean, the trick for us is to keep our ears open the whole time. I think the biggest value we may be offering here is in giving a little structure to what's otherwise could be an unwieldy topic or set of topics, but not kind of not setting it in stone. So it's a structure that is intended to be kicked at, pushed around, poked at. And at the end of the day, after all these conversations and the different forms they'll take, we think that some of those areas that we've outlined are going to light up more than others. And those are the ones that will show up, in bold in the report. So we just want to make sure we've foregrounded what we think the range is, and then we sit back and we listen to what really excites people about taking forward.
And I'd like to thank all of you for helping us to at least understand on this group what some of those things are. So to go to Nathan, Nathan's asking, and again, this came to us and not to the whole group, but in relation to OA, inclusivity, equality, et cetera, in research scholarly communication, does not the enormous issue of access DRM not affect all academic communities? In other words, until institutions, libraries, et cetera, are able to own, in quotes, materials and use and share equitably rather than leasing access and shattering our budgets, every community is underserved with unfair access to scholarly communication. Yes, and the whole copyright licensing, DRM, all of that is something that's very much on our agenda. That we're looking at already to take a look at. Can't have this conversation without having that conversation for sure.
So you can tell at this point, our mode is we're not taking anything off the table just yet, right? So, which is why those focus groups and that survey are really, really important. They're really important because for this to actually be an interesting document at the end of the day, we hope that there'll be some overriding messages that come out of the community about which of these many, many things really feels like the most important. Right now, it feels like there are a million. And we're hoping we can now.
Sorry, could you go back to the slide where the focus groups are? So
Sure.
maybe keep that up for the next few minutes so that, again, these are the dates and times for our virtual focus groups, which will be done via Zoom, and we'll be sending more information out to people about that, including, I hope, everybody who is on this call. But if you're already able to start to think about, if you're interested in participating in one of these focus groups and you already know what your schedule looks like, these are the ones that we've set. So and again, they will have different focuses, but we would accommodate people who are not necessarily within one of those categories already. So if there are some ones that you know, we'd welcome you to be participants there.
Are there any additional questions?
I would just, Rebecca, would you mind if I just, as before we close out the session, if I just leave our contact information up on the screen as an open invitation to be in touch as things go forward, if you have other thoughts that you'd like to share or questions.
Well, thank you, Nancy and Rebecca. This is Yasmin Shurush. I'm the Vice Chair for the Research and Scholarly Environment Committee, and starting on July 1st, I'll come into the chair position. And I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar and asking great questions. I encourage you all to please do participate in those focus groups, and also if you will be at ALA Annual, we have those 2 sessions on Sunday, one at 2:30 in the Convention Center, where we'll be, Patricia will lead a discussion delving into this topic a little bit more, and then we'll be followed by one of the roundtable events with Nancy and Rebecca, also in the Convention Center at 4 o'clock that day. As Nancy mentioned in the timeline, we are looking to have a finalized agenda out in the early month or so of 2019. And we recognize that kind of throwing an agenda out into the wild and saying, look, we did a thing, enjoy it, is not really accessible. So the committee will be, is looking at doing some programming at annual and midwinter in ways to support that agenda, to make it livable and accessible. I think Nancy and Rebecca have done some really nice work speaking with the committee about how to make the agenda accessible for various types of institutions. And kind of, I think you called it signposting various ways to engage. And the committee is also looking to provide some research agenda grants to help institutions adopt the agenda and get it off the ground and be a model for other institutions as well. So we're talking about, I think Nancy mentioned some culture change with this effort, and we are sensitive to the fact that that takes a lot of resourcing and intentionality to make that happen. So, so please keep involved, keep engaged, and look for this work to continue, through 2019. And if there's no other questions, we're at the end of the presentation.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nancy and Rebecca.
Thank you.
All right.